To start making a silicone mold from caulk, I set out my parchment paper, a bottle of acrylic paint. Here's my caulk. It's 100% silicone, clear, and you want to make sure that it cures with acetic acid. You'll find that on the back. You don't want it to have ammonia in it. That will not work for this process. So make sure it says acetic acid cure. And this one is GE1 brand. And now there are a couple of ways to go about securing your piece to be molded. The first I'm going to show you is using painter's tape. And this really only works for flat-backed pieces. There's another way to deal with pieces that aren't quite flat-backed. I'll show you that in a minute. But first I'll show you this way. You use bits of tape to tape the painter's tape face side up, sticky side up, so that your pieces will be able to stick down to it. I'll do a couple of strips of this depending on the size of the pieces, obviously, and make sure that they are stuck down to each other at the seam very well so that there's no gappage. Now I'm going to press these pieces down in there. Got a couple of little moon pieces here. And I'm going to use a cookie cutter as sort of a mold box for them. I'm not going to actually use the one you've seen here because it just wasn't quite right for it, but you'll see later on the cutter that I used. So you're just going to center your cutter around it and press it down. And now we're going to set this aside and we'll start mixing up the silicone. I'm starting with some cornstarch here, and I've got my acrylic paint and my parchment paper. I'm going to pour out a little mound of my cornstarch and spread it out, making sure that there are no bald spots because the silicone caulk will stick to everything. So we want to make sure we have a nice even mound of cornstarch. And then we're going to express the caulk in as much of it. You want to eyeball how much you're going to need for your piece. Better too much than too little. And you're going to express it out onto the mound. And then we're going to take some acrylic paint and we're going to put a good squeeze of paint onto the silicone. And then we're going to top off with a little more sprinkling of cornstarch. You'll see that you don't want to use, I'll show you that this one actually ended up having a little too much cornstarch added in the end, which made it just cure a little too quickly, but you'll see that later. Basically now I'm going to take my parchment paper and I'm going to use that to go back and forth folding the silicone in the cornstarch. That way it doesn't stick to anything, because again, once that caulk sticks to anything, your gloves or anything, it's not going to just come off. It's not like you could add more cornstarch to your finger and then it'll come off. You'll have to change your gloves or it'll be a big mess and just continue building on your hands, sticking. So you really want to make sure that you're going slow at first to just incorporate that cornstarch into your caulk. That way, yeah, it's not sticking. You're going to, at a certain point, it will become absorbed enough that you'll be able to handle it with your fingers, but right now that's not the case. And I'd say the whole process, you have maybe about 7 minutes probably before it becomes a little bit harder to work. And you really want it to be that perfect combination of not too sticky but not too firm that it's going to clump up and start to cure too quickly and maybe not take the detail that you want it to. Okay, so you can see here now that I'm able to work it with my hand a little bit and that the silicone absorbs quite a bit of cornstarch. As you work it, you'd be surprised how much cornstarch it really can take. And it's easy to add a little too much in the end, but keep working it and make sure that you're only adding more when you absolutely need to. And here I think I'm still okay at this point. I haven't added too much, but a little later you'll see that I have finally added a little much. It did work out. I was able to make one mold out of it, but the problem is that I was hoping to get a second mold out of this one ball, and by the time I was done pressing out the first mold, the other one had solidified. So it was a little too much at that point. And again, if I'd have mixed up the correct amount, it would have been just fine. But I was, trying, see right here, that's the perfect consistency. It was just a little sticky, and I'm adding a little bit more, and again, it was fine. but I'll go a little too far in a minute, and it's going to be it's again still worked, but I was only able to get one mold out of it. You want to make sure that there's no powdery residue left on it. You want it to be nice and workable with your hands, and it's just the perfect, you don't want it to be sticking to the glove. If it's sticking to the glove, you need way more cornstarch. So it's a nice smooth, it's taking an impression, and this is pretty much what you want it to look like right here. Maybe just a little bit less cornstarch. So now I've got my new cookie cutter around there, and I'm just going to press this down. The cookie cutter creates a nice counter pressure against the putty, so that it really presses all those details around your piece. And just keep pressing it down, but you only want to press for a short amount of time, because as it's curing, the more you press, it will tend to create lines and buckled areas around your piece. So you want to just get the initial firm pressure. You can even use a rolling pin to roll across the top and even it out, and then you want to leave it alone. Okay, so now I'm going to show the other way I make it, where I press the piece itself into the silicone. This is a flat back piece, so I could have done it on the tape, but I just want to show you the other way. This is great for pieces that don't have a flat back, that you would have to sort of press down from the top. So again, I've got my cornstarch, and I'm going to make my little pile and spread it out. And again, make sure there's no gaps, there's no bald spots, or it will stick right to that parchment paper and it'll be a mess. So I'm going to dispense my caulk, and again, a little bit more is better than having too little and then not having, having to like quickly try to mix it up. It's not going to work. So just make sure that you've erred on the side of more versus less. And I'd like to add that this should be done in a well-ventilated area, because the acetic acid smells very badly of vinegar. So keep that in mind. The cornstarch method stinks a lot less than the water and soap method, so that's why one of the reasons why I prefer the cornstarch method. So now I'm going to add a big clump of my, almost out of paint here. I'm going to add a good amount of my teal paint right to the top, and I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of more cornstarch on top to sort of, make sure there's no sticking when I go to fold it over. And see, this time I'm using a little bit less cornstarch, just a little bit, and I'm, making sure to work it in before I add more. I know it's still quite a bit of cornstarch, and it looks like a lot, but it is a little bit less than I did the first time. So now I'm going to just start my folding and keep going. You want to take your time, and I know when I said before 7 minutes is not a lot of time, but when you're actually doing it, don't panic. Just get it blended. Take your time, it'll be fine. Oh, there's a little piece there that, see, it got stuck and stuck to the parchment, and I'm trying to work it in with my fingers. And when you do start touching it with your fingers, make sure you do it gingerly, because you don't want to like really grab onto it and push through that layer of cornstarch and end up sticking really badly to your gloves. Make sure when you pick it up, it's very light, very, very gentle, and then sort of start testing out how much more pressure you can put on with your hand. This is, as you can see, getting a little sticky on my gloves, and I'm sort of, I'm sort of being a little bit messy with it here at this point. So I'm working it in, and it's a little sticky, so I'm just going to add a little bit more. And you can see how sticky it is when it's coming away, like kind of roughly. You want it to have that real smooth dough texture. And you can see this time I'm really working it between my fingers to get it all uniform before I decide whether or not I'm going to add a little bit more cornstarch. I really want to work it in, get it nice and uniform, and I've decided that it is just right. So I'm just going to make a ball, pat it down, and I'm going to just press my piece right down into it, making sure that it's relatively even and level to the surface. That way, if I wanted to pour resin into it or something, it would be as level as possible. And I'm actually making a little well, building that little well around the edges of the piece, making sure it's getting right up there, but not too much over the back of it, so it's not going to create a weird lip. Just going to even that up and give it a little bit of depth around the edge so that it creates like a well effect. So that if I pour resin into it again, because I use these to press polymer clay and I also use them for resin. So you want to think ahead for what your needs are. And again, leave it alone after about 40 seconds of pressing, maybe even less. That way it doesn't wrinkle up against your piece and create a bad mold. Now we're going to let this cure for about an hour and then demold it. And I'm just going to gently begin pulling it away, and it comes out with ease. And it's just as good as, mold putty that you can buy. And it's flexible, and it's I would say it's not quite as flexible as a platinum cure silicone, or as the water method, which I love the way the water method, the molds look beautiful, but they're just not as good of a mold, and they're a little bit jello-y, whereas these are still bendable, but they are a little firmer. So that's why I prefer the cornstarch method. All right, now I'm going to check on my little moons, and you just pull the tape right up off the tile, and it peels right off the back of the mold, and look at what a beautiful, flat, smooth surface you get with that, and the perfect edges on those moons. It's really gorgeous, and takes a little bit to gently sort of coax the mold out of the cookie cutter. I will say that the plastic cookie cutters are easier to demold than the metal ones tend to be, in my experience. And like the circular one with the scalloped edge that you saw earlier, that one is in the past I found that it's very difficult to get the silicone to pop out of that one with the scalloped edge. It's a real pain in the butt. So I remembered that I'd had these little cheap kids plastic ones around, and so I went with those, and it was a lot better. So I'm just going to gently demold these, and I can tell this came out really good. I don't see any air bubbles. It's got a lot of good detail, and the edges are absolutely perfection. So I'm really pleased with the way this came out. One thing I will say though is that when I initially packed the mold, I didn't quite fill it all the way up, and so it's not perfectly level there. So when I go to cast it, it's not going to be level to the table. So what I'll do is I'll mix up a new batch of putty, and I'll pack it in there, and then I'll use a rolling pin and just roll it across the top to make it perfectly level. I'll wipe that down with a wet wipe first so that there's no excess cornstarch on the surface, and that way the new layer of silicone will blend seamlessly with the old. And these, in my opinion, are just as good as, if not better, than the putties that you can buy for a lot more money. And I hope you enjoy it and have a lot of fun making molds. I think that by adding your own sculptural clay elements to your electroformed pieces, it really gives you an opportunity to differentiate yourself and add those unique little one-of-a-kind elements that are all purely from you.